So I'm Alex Cosmas. As Stefan mentioned, we're from Booz Allen. My colleagues Swapnil and Michael in the back there. So Booz Allen is a 100-year-old consultancy, which is celebrating our centennial this year. And we have about a 3,000-person strong analytics practice. And the primary function of the analytics practice, it's still an externally facing consulting group, is to help our clients, large governmental organizations, Fortune 100s, monetize data, extract the most value from their data, and also apply non-data intensive analytical techniques to simulate alternative futures, what-if analyses. And obviously, in the spirit of this conference and the discussions we've heard around causality, I thought it'd be interesting to, I apologize for the cheesy title, but the intent is ultimately to say it's no longer really good enough or cool enough to employ predictive analytics and validate that your model predicts with high accuracy. In the end, in order for data to increasingly gain acceptance from the executive ranks, from the general management ranks, we're seeing the need to actually answer the so what more often, and what should I do about it even more often now. So the intent of the talk, I think, is really to, in the frame of a Bayesian network, in the frame of Bayesian inference, share a little bit about how we've been able to add the causal layer to a lot of what I think traditionally has been what we're calling an overburdening of data in data science. So let me actually start with an interesting anecdote. I was at a Disney held an analytics conference a couple weeks ago, and the keynote speaker was a guy by the name of Beane. Now, how many people have watched Moneyball? How many people have read Moneyball, the book? So Beane is the main character of the story in Moneyball, and he was the continues to be the general manager of the Oakland Athletics, which is a relatively small market team, despite it being next to San Francisco in the Bay Area, not a very well-funded team. And the story of Moneyball is how this notion of sabermetrics, so-called use of analytics for on-field play, started to revolutionize the game of baseball, and truly has revolutionized it, and allowed a small market team to actually compete with the New York Yankees and the Boston Red Sox. So Billy had this very interesting story. He presented his own baseball stats. He was a former baseball player in his early career, and he was a horrible player. And he said, I should have never been drafted. He was drafted number 2 the year he was drafted. Number 1 was Darryl Strawberry, who many folks may know if you enjoyed baseball in the 80s. So he was drafted number 2, was supposed to be one of the future Hall of Famer, and his stats didn't add up. And ultimately, his own explanation for why he was drafted is that there was an over-reliance upon the gut of the baseball community and the scouts specifically to pick players that looked like baseball players, to pick players that looked good in a baseball uniform, can speak to the media, had leadership presence, not necessarily go purely based on numbers. And had they gone based on numbers from his high school career, they said he would have never been drafted. So fast forward, Moneyball, ultimately the key element within Moneyball that allowed Brad Pitt plays Billy Beane, which was an interesting choice. But Brad Pitt is in a room with all of his scouts, and he says, we're focusing on the wrong thing. There are 6 metrics that we all typically focus on for winning baseball games and recruiting talent. Things like runs batted in, home run percentage. And none of that wins baseball games. Getting on base wins baseball games. If a player is more likely to get on base, and so on and so forth, we have a team of players that individually are very likely to get on base, you have a higher likelihood of ultimately rounding the bases, landing a run, and that's how you win baseball games. And the entire industry blew up as a result of this core insight that we're going to spend money not on recruiting people who look like baseball players, people that could hit home runs, people that could play the infield, but rather people that actually could get on base. So that sounded to me very much like a increase in number of players that have a propensity to get on base, and therefore you will win games. Sounded to me like a correlation problem, or a correlation, an association, not necessarily a causal link. So I asked Billy, somewhat embarrassingly, what gave you the confidence to know that that's actually going to drive games, and it's not, if you are a team that wins a lot of games, you happen to get on base, because by definition you have to get on base. So there's a correlation versus causation issue. And his answer was, well, it's a no-brainer. I'm a baseball player. I just know that. I didn't know that. I don't know how many people of you knew that it's actually there's a causation, there's a causal link between getting on base that is a non-simple by-accident association with winning games. And I guess to some degree, if everyone had a 90%, if every player individually had a 90% plus likelihood of getting on base, and it happened over and over and over and over again, it doesn't matter what you're hitting or if you're being walked. It doesn't matter how you get on base. You're just getting on base, and ultimately you're not striking out, and therefore you win a game. But that set the stage, I think, a little bit, in my mind, for the reliance on the industry of just knowing things that you know, and the importance of actually fusing that with data that actually supports your hypothesis or not. So everyone, I think, has seen this analytics hierarchy, descriptive analytics, predictive analytics, prescriptive. And it truly is a hierarchy. You're kind of cooler the more prescriptive you get, right? Predictive's out. Now you have to be prescriptive in order to be cool. And the descriptions are, descriptive, what happened or what is happening in my system. Predictive, what will happen. And the prescriptive is, given my future, what should I do? The interesting premise is that, in my mind, all three of these they're in a correlation framework. They still rely on things happening, and where we are sort of bystanders living in the system, but not necessarily influencing the system. So we put them in a correlation column and introduce this causation column, again, along the same descriptive, predictive, prescriptive path. But the ability to not just say what happened and what is happening, but why is it happening, is much more powerful to the decision maker. Why will something in the future that we predict happen? And most importantly, the real golden nugget on what I think prescriptive analytics, most people mean by it, but doesn't actually happen often, is given what I choose to do, what is my best or optimal future? Not given my future, what should I do? So we think oftentimes about operations research and classic optimization of falling in the realm of prescriptive analytics. Meaning, how should I schedule my fleet? I'm UPS. How should I schedule my fleet optimally to minimize transit time, minimize fuel burn, minimize hours of paid staff? But you're operating in an environment where you're assuming distributions for congestion, for traffic, for fuel burn, not necessarily influencing it. There's no feedback mechanism once I schedule that optimal schedule, the optimal route structure, the optimal timing. There's no feedback mechanisms that ultimately says, so do I now have a new future that is the constraints of fuel burn and congestion that I should operate in? And that feedback mechanism is actually critically important in the world of decision optimization, and that is simulation. We simulate alternative worlds, and it requires us to have a basic understanding of the foundational dynamics of a system. We have to have the rules of a system. So agent-based modeling, discrete event simulations live in the world on the right, where we're assuming some causal dynamics. We're assuming some underlying dynamics, and they're mathematical equations. They're not necessarily data informed in today's paradigm. So I like this quote because I think it captures, as a community, what really we should all be focused in. It's from the co-founder of Crazy Egg and Kissmetrics, what action will I take once I have this data? If the answer is no action, it's generally a bad idea to even consider looking at the data in the first place, because it's information overload, it's confusing. There's some exceptions to this where pure description of an association actually drives behavior, but it's because of a cognitive model that ingests it and then ultimately does this prescription on the right-hand side. The goal of the modeling community and the data science community specifically is to allow a lot of the evidence, or the empirical data that's being pumped out increasingly, to inform or replace a lot of that cognitive behavior. So so in Booz Allen, we have, as part of this giant analytics community, we have a data science practice, and I'm one of the leaders in our data science practice. And on a daily basis, I have this argument with mostly classically trained technologists that grew up and became data scientists through the computer science ranks, but not necessarily the artificial intelligence ranks, but more so the technologist ranks. So they can spin up Hadoop clusters better than anybody, and they can jam, a flurry of optimization algorithms, parameter estimation algorithms, random forest, and they'll run support vector machines, and they can do it until the cows come home, and they're very good at it. But the second you ask a difficult question, like, so why do I care, or can I really trust that the parameters are accurate, or that my data input's accurate, the easy answer is garbage in, garbage out. You gotta, you gave me the data, I'm just machine learning it. And I think because of the data being pumped out at record volumes, there's this blind reliance on mining this data to produce information and association. And I inserted useless information overload, because things like Snapple cap facts, which I consider in many cases useless information. Real fact number 10, mosquitoes are attracted to people who just ate bananas. Did anybody know that? Okay, we have a couple head nodders, so I'll watch out for you guys because we keep going with this example. But most people are like, you read the Snapple cap, that's interesting. There's hundreds of these examples. It suggests some level of causality, and may influence behavior of certain folks to not eat bananas on a hot summer day before they walk into the forest. But in general, it's an interesting fact, potentially useless. So it's an example of, I like this quote from Chris Anderson, the former editor-in-chief of Wired magazine, which is, petabytes allow us to say correlation is enough. Because we have so much data supporting our theory, then I don't care what the SMEs say. I don't care what the domain experts say. Correlation's enough. And it's an over-reliance upon data, and it's very dangerous. So we really need to migrate past this association, and how do we do it is the big question. So in the Bayesian network paradigm, let's say, A and B, we've got banana consumption, mosquito attraction. A BBN structure can easily represent the joint condition, sort of the joint probability distribution of the two variables in either direction. They're structurally equivalent. And at some point, we have to ask the question, is it sufficient, if there's mutual information and there's a correlation between our two variables, is that enough? Is that the explanation? Or as a modeler, is there some latent intermediary that I need to introduce in order to determine why something's happening? Because obviously in this situation, I can't determine why something's happening, or even if it's relevant or coincidental. So the premise of combining structural learning a set of rules or input, it requires us to accept the fact that there are some givens that we need to introduce into our model, and not everything will simply be machine learned and told to us. So can be determined using a combination of machine learning and a set of general principles. So if you think about things like mutual information, if node A is causal to node B, there's no way I cannot have mutual information. So it's a minimum condition. There needs to be some mutual information in order between causal elements. Necessary but not sufficient. I'm not telling you what's causal, I'm just telling you what cannot be causal. Things like temporalization. I can't have a cause go back in time and create an effect. So the timeline by which a node occurs, someone ate a banana and then a mosquito bit me, is actually an expert input. It's a model or input. It's not necessarily something that's machine learned, but it's an important consideration in, again, driving down to what is possibly causal. More importantly, what cannot be causal, what is definitely not causal because of the temporal time gap. And this, by the way, is the failure of the Google flu prediction model, where there was temporal autocorrelation. We thought we can predict the flu based on previous instances, and you have a failure in ultimately causality. They were looking for leading indicators, not causality, but it was a failure because of temporal autocorrelation. The cause and effect is another interesting model where, again, I'm relying upon the user. Oops, I apologize. I'm relying upon the modeler to tell me, or the expert opinion that the modeler is working with. I need you to actually build me the framework by which I know, whether it's a psychologist or a behavioral economist, the mechanism by which people are influenced to do things. There's an example, so behavioral economists, I think, call this a nudge, where there's a piece of information that's provided to a consumer and it influences a behavior. Think about if you get your monthly energy bills and you see how you're doing compared to your neighbors. There may be a direct, more likely an indirect subconscious change in your behavior as a result of that. We're just providing information. We're not necessarily creating a new incentive program to do that. I think, for the gentleman in the room, urinals that have the little fly on it and suddenly, everyone's aim is better. Is that causal, or you're providing information that's ultimately processed cognitively, and people can choose to aim or not aim? I don't know, but it's an example used for this by behavioral economists for this nudge effect. It's pretty interesting. But knowing that, hey, you know what, that's not a cause. There's situations where cause and effect are living and thriving in our data. In other situations where I'm simply providing information and something happens in the brain that we don't necessarily observe in data, having the distinction is actually pretty important. So there were a few head nods in the room, probably some biologists that can explain the linkage here, but fortunately I have a microphone, so I'm going to make it up as I go. We have banana consumption, as we said, implicit causation, mosquito attraction, and we survey a number of experts that say, well, 3 things happen when you eat bananas. Or better yet, we can work backwards and say mosquitoes in laboratory experiments have been known to increase their propensity their attraction to people with these 3 elements. One is a higher body heat. Higher body heat attracts mosquitoes. A particular types of body sense, not necessarily more scent, but types of body sense, and your production of CO2. The higher your CO2, the higher the attraction of mosquitoes. Now, each of these edges here can be proven experimentally, or at least supported experimentally, and these edges here can also be supported experimentally. We're still in an association world until I introduce the premise that banana consumption reduces body heat, in fact, by balancing the electrolytes in the body. Banana consumption, I guess you smell different after you eat a banana, which is apparently experiments have been done. And when you eat banana and you're digesting it, you increase your breathing rate and your CO2 levels. So it's possible that there is actually a causal flow from left to right. Now, again, it's interesting information, but not necessarily useful to make a change unless I could provide a causal link or the ability to control some of these elements. So we can skip that. The second piece of the puzzle, when we've identified causation versus correlation, is the subset of causal elements that are actually controllable versus the many that are not controllable. So if we look at the same BBN as before, actually I'll do that in a sec. I like this quote as well. Bruce Ernst, VP of Product Management at Monetate, gathering data is important, but it's crucial to be able to differentiate between data that is merely interesting and data that actually has leverage. And that captures the essence of why controllability is so important. If I don't have control over an element, it doesn't have leverage per se. It's interesting. So using interactions, or sorry, not using interactions, if we use the same BBN as before, and we actually affect, if a particular, let's say, individual is looking to control, after they decided, hey, I want to eat a banana, they want to actually control or minimize the likelihood of mosquito being attracted, they can actually try to change the body heat production. It's very difficult to do biologically, so maybe I throw on a sweater and I'm putting off less heat. I have that in my control. But it's unlikely to be, I'm unlikely to want to put on more clothing if I'm in an environment where mosquitoes are out, because maybe it's a hot day, or maybe it's something I'm outside. So similar, I can't really regulate my CO2 levels easily. Yoga, calm breathing, but again, that's not something that enters a typical mind when I'm simply eating a banana and then walking outside. But body scent is an easy intervention to make, and so you've seen time and time again the lowest hanging fruit for a company to make money off of this direct connection between banana consumption and mosquito attraction is to provide an intervention for body scent. There's no biologics involved. I'm just going to spray something that smells different and masks whatever I naturally smell like. And all of a sudden I have an intervention for something that I've theoretically already assumed to be causal. If it were not causal, they wouldn't make any money, because over time the market would learn that that does nothing. So an example that I think is very interesting, because I spent a lot of time in the aviation transportation space, is the modeling of flight delays. So those of you who travel know that airlines find it very difficult to tell you the likelihood a flight's going to be on time or delayed when you're sitting at the gate 20 minutes before the flight. They still get it wrong half the time. So we had the challenge, we were hired by the FAA to predict flight delays months before they occur. Think about how difficult that is. And part of the reason, it's not just a research exercise. The FAA actually conducts a lot of planning months in advance based on what they expect, what they call sector loads, or what airspace congestion, airspace loads will be. And more importantly, they want to mitigate and minimize flight delays. So if we can uncover some of the core causal layers, not just interesting association, but what's actually driving and causing flight delays for some proportion of flights, can we try to stamp it out? So we had 5 data sets, about 100 million records of various sources that had to be joined, but more importantly, painstakingly down-selected and transformed by experts, air traffic controllers, pilots, FAA scientists, to provide insight into the likelihood that there's any explanatory power in any of the variables among the hundreds we looked at, and whether the creation of new interaction terms is actually where the explanatory power lies, normalizing something. So the majority of the time was not spent machine learning the structure of the BBN. The majority of the time was spent on our input, the identification of variables that could plausibly, even in some 10th order world, provide some semblance of explanatory power to delays, a particular given flight delay. And reintroducing this concept of controllable and uncontrollable, If for a particular population I have a mean departure delay of expected 7 minutes, roughly, I can see the impact of, through likelihood matching or statistical matching, the impact of modifying evidence of a single node on the target variable, or departure delay. So in this case, taxi out time proves to be one of the most highly correlated leading indicators of delay, because there's so much uncertainty between pushing back from the gate and actually wheels off the ground. The longer you draw out that period of time, the more likely it is something that can go wrong in between, or that there's room for queuing. And your typical airport controller is not going to want to starve your runway, so they actually want to have a queue, a sufficient queue size, so that the runway, which clearly is the bottleneck in the U.S. system, we want to maximize the use of those resources. But I can't control the taxi out time for a particular airport and a particular runway configuration. I am JFK, I am Boston Logan, I am LAX, and if I'm running this configuration at this time of day, it becomes an intrinsic attribute of my operation. I can't really modify that. So very powerful leading indicator, can't do much with it. Now, scheduled turn times, conversely, are actually very controllable. And a couple years ago, you might have seen a huge flurry of media articles yelling and angry at the airlines for padding schedules. And what padding essentially does is say, I'm going to claim that my gate-to-gate time, my block time, is actually longer than I really need it to be. And it allows me to get there on time more often, which is one of the core metrics airlines get rated on by the regulators and also by us, by customers. So would you notice that a flight is 10 minutes longer, even between two competitors, same flights, roughly same time, that one is 10 minutes longer than the other? Less likely, you're more likely going to notice that one is 40% on time, the other 70% on time. It's a very simple adjustment. So highly controllable variable, highly used, but this is one example. So our goal was to say, and it's only controllable by the airline. The FAA doesn't schedule flights. The airports don't schedule flights, and consumers, passengers don't schedule flights. So interestingly, one of the outcomes is the ability to predict the likelihood of delay for a particular flight on a particular future date and time. No model to date has been able to do that. You go into Kayak, you want to buy a flight, you can see the % of time the flight is on time. And some airlines even offer that information when you're buying on their sites. But that's a historical view. They look at trailing 12 months. They look at that flight number. They don't even really isolate by day, which would seem like an obvious condition, right? Because Mondays and Saturdays are fundamentally different. But they don't. They look at 12 months, and they give you that number, 70% on time. Interesting, may influence my behavior to purchase or not to purchase. But the ability to say two identical flight numbers within the same week on 2 different days within the same month may actually have fundamentally different delay profiles, because one has an inbound flight, which, what we call line of flight, where aircraft tails are actually circulated. That's fundamentally different. One's coming from Vancouver, the other's coming from Phoenix. And their likelihoods of delay are fundamentally different. So the profiles of the network effects work their way through, in many cases, observable nodes, in some cases, latent variables. So I leave tonight on a red eye at 9:40 p.m. to Boston. Our model predicts it's a 72% chance of being on time. So we'll see. Email me after. And we compare it to status quo, or what's currently done today. The FAA uses this system called TFMS that predicts starting 24 hours prior to a flight down to the wheels up. They predict likelihood of departure delay, but they only start 24 hours in advance. So we wanted to compare how well do we do with this, given that we understand this is a highly dimensional problem, and that TFMS and no other model can actually capture the high dimensionality of the problem, and the temporalization effects, and, by the way, the network effects of outbound delays on one aircraft or one airport actually propagate through my system. And same thing with cruise. So the 0 mark is normalized against TFMS. Our model could better predict departure delays against the day of model across the board, months in advance, better than a regression-based TFMS, the FAA's current model can do. And it's really only because we were able to introduce the dimensionality of the, so we're still predicting. We haven't done really any causal inference yet. The FAA, of course, was very excited and is interested in, okay, so what? So what do I do now? Can I actually reduce the number at all? So managing flight delays is as important, if not more important, as being able to actually predict that they occur. So the prediction gives us confidence that our model is structurally correct, that it explains the data, but how do we use it now for informing decisions? So we have this 2x2 matrix here where we've got my leading indicators up top, and leading indicators are just associations and correlations with the added dimension that they happened before the thing I'm trying to predict, which is pretty typical. You'd want to do that. And then you have your causal elements. So these are just a selection of the few dozen nodes that you saw in the previous BBN. But things like the distance between our airports are leading indicators. Are leading indicators, but they're uncontrollable. If I need to get from Boston to LA, can't really change anything about the distance between the cities. But the distance does actually provide me information into the likelihood of delay. Passenger split types, things like the percent of the plane, 150 passengers, that are local traffic versus connecting traffic. Airlines have a propensity to cancel local first because you screw up the fewest amount of itineraries. If you have a lot of connecting traffic, you're actually better off from an airline perspective. But that's, again, a leading indicator. It's not the cause. It's made it cause the airline to make a concerted change or cancellation. But it is a leading indicator, not directly causal to the delay itself. Now we've got causal elements that are uncontrollable. Classic examples: weather. Very good leading indicator. I have weather forecasts. Airlines and FAA make decisions about flight reroutings and cancellations based on forecasts, not actual weather, typically. But I can't do anything about it. I can't control the weather. So there's this column of controllable elements, which, depending on what I'm trying to do, I have a different stakeholder who actually has control over these elements. And no one really has control over all of them. So all these little dudes are us, the passengers. If we're trying to avoid delays, we have the ability to say, I can change the airline that I choose to fly. I could change the month that I choose to fly on, day of week, origin airport. I might use Burbank instead of LAX, and so on. I have that as consumer choice. I have the ability to avoid delays, but I don't have the ability to control delays. The delays will still happen. I just won't be on the plane. I won't be part of them. Airlines have control over certain leading indicators, but more importantly, over certain causal indicators. So tail assignment. I can assign an old clunky 737 or sorry, an MD-80. Most of the 737s are pretty new out there. The old clunky MD-80 has a higher likelihood of a maintenance issue occurring. And I have fewer of them, so I can potentially not swap out aircraft as frequently, as often, because there's different seat configurations. So the specific tail number that I choose to assign as an airline is a direct causal contributor to delay, or to minimize delays. We talked about scheduling, scheduled turn time, taxi time, block time. So all your schedule, airlines have control. Your airport can change its configuration. We're going to operate an east-west pattern with 3 parallel runways, no diagonals, or we're going to risk it. We're going to risk the crosswind, and we're going to fly a lower capacity pattern. An airport has that ability in conjunction with the FAA. And then there are these traffic management initiatives in miles and trail, which are the overwhelming source of delays in our system. It's the FAA deciding that we don't want to overburden our controllers in a particular part of the airspace. And therefore, we're going to hold ground stops. We're going to hold aircraft at a particular airport. That is 100% causal. It is generally the direct cause of the majority of delays in the airspace system. And they're fully controllable by, again, the FAA. So one of the outcomes of this type of a modeling exercise is not that any of these surprise the expert community. However, they do highlight the importance of focusing on the things you can control and focusing on the things that we collectively believe are causal. Otherwise, you're sort of wasting your time, and it's just interesting information. So a couple of case studies where we did similar things, and this is the last set that I've got. For a global consumer products company, very large consumer products company, one of their questions is what drives consumer sentiment? And it's I mean, similar to the Dell talk that we just heard. I can spend my money, and I do spend my money, in any variety of ways. There's social spending, philanthropic spending. There's actually direct PR and marketing. I can focus on improving my products. There's elements of ultimately what's the ROI of each of those investments. And we could isolate the contribution of each, but as we just heard, it's really a portfolio product, and you have to do a little bit of everything at once and try to optimize the contributions. In this case, the question is what drives customer sentiment as measured by not only sales and number of returns, but number of complaints, whether through social media, what's the general Twitter track sentiment on Twitter and the blog space, and surveys, which I think everyone is always suspect of, but actually provide a very important anecdotal evidence that you can't necessarily see through revealed preference. So the power of a BBN in this case is the fusing of multiple data sources, real live spending, real live revenue, point of sale data. I can actually look at what people are buying with survey data, sometimes joined by the name of the individual, so that I can tell you what that sentiment is and how it's tracked over time. But more often than not, I can't do that. But I still need the ability to capture distributions of sentiment. And do not likelihood matching, probabilistically matching a named customer with the demographics of the people that surveyed in a certain way. And what actions could we take to improve it? So if I have $100 million, where do I spend it? $10 million, where do I spend it? For a U.S. airline, we focused on what's a passenger's expected valuation of an itinerary? What is an individual passenger's willingness to pay for a specific itinerary at a specific time on your airline? And it's not by using aggregated historical data, but rather a series of pattern tracking of individuals searching on websites for airfare, down selecting the majority, selecting one, in many cases selecting none, and over time crowdsourcing, if you will, the independent leading indicators of what a particular passenger, let's say myself, is for a specific flight, and how that valuation would change if all of a sudden my connection in St. Louis were 40 minutes instead of 30 minutes. Would that increase my willingness to pay by $5 or decrease it? And so when an airline builds its schedule, which is really the product of an airline, that's an important consideration. Today, airlines, even the most sophisticated in the world, do not build itineraries by optimizing the attractiveness of itineraries. They schedule metal, they schedule legs and segments, and the itineraries sort of happen by accident. We adjust banking times so that we can allow people to connect, but we don't take the global world of demand for travel between city A and city B on a type of itinerary, and then build my schedule down. We build the schedule up from where our metal is actually going to fly, and then we decide which itineraries we want to price. It's, in my mind, completely backwards, but the reason is historically it's been very hard to get that level of fidelity on my origin destination demand. All I know is my aircraft historically have been filled or they've been empty, and what my revenue has been on the plane. So there's good reason for it, but this particular airline is actually taking a leap of faith to go top down. Asset management. So, there are a number of both governmental and private sector organizations that have thousands upon thousands of assets all around the world. Some are staffed, some are unstaffed, some are up on mountaintops that no one checks on for years at a time. Some are office buildings where people are there every day. How do I determine what the reliability of my assets are that I maybe haven't really tested? I know, the build year, I know square footage, I know energy consumption, but I may not really know, and I don't want to send a civil engineer out to thousands of assets to determine reliability. So can I piece together the fingerprint of reliability for that asset, or for thousands of assets, based on what I do know about maybe 10% of my population? And then ultimately, if I then prioritize how I'm going to spend my money, it's not just about reliability, but how far does a dollar go in work order repair on improving the reliability of each of those assets. So it becomes a very large optimization problem, but that's how asset allocation or asset management should actually be done. So for an organization that manages, regulates the transport of hazardous materials in the U.S., it's called PHMSA, Pipelines and Hazardous Materials. And by the way, you're seeing a lot of augmented naive Bayes networks just because they look cool, not necessarily the model delivered in every case. Parsimony is still key, and we do deliver smaller networks where possible, but they look cooler, right? So PHMSA is interested in, again, regulating, but also influencing how do I transport lithium-ion batteries, how do I transport explosive chemicals, and how do I do it in a way that minimizes the likelihood of an incident and then likelihood or impact to the population given an incident. So again, it's not a transportation optimization problem, it's the objective function is minimizing risk. Stochastic optimization. And then a global hotel chain. I think last year, for those of you that were at the conference, we actually presented a deep dive into this BBN that we constructed for a hotel chain about how do we incentivize our guests to book incremental nights. Particularly, what are the elements of or the attributes of a promotional campaign that I can confidently credit to driving one incremental night for me, Alex, versus what I have done it anyway, and you just gave away points for no reason at all. So these sorts of questions of, again, when we move towards the data-driven society where the Internet of Things, where everybody's connected and pumping out information about themselves, how do I leverage information as a private sector entity looking to monetize and make better decisions and better products and better services for you, a consumer. So, final quote, if your insights are not both causal and controllable, they get us no closer to an actionable solution. So it's kind of a call to action for all of us in the modeling community to lead with things that actually influence decisions, not lead with interesting facts. So identifying causality is important. It means integrate with the business user and integrate with the domain expert. Don't rely on data to tell you everything. I think everybody here knows that. And of course, the controllability aspect. Things that are controllable may not necessarily be easily controllable or controllable at cost. So having the interest having the business unit's interest in mind is actually critically important if we're going to gain widespread acceptance as an analytics community, which I mean, we were called by a McKinsey Global Institute report the sexiest profession, right, of the 21st century. I'm not seeing it. I don't get approached on the street and said, hey, it's a pretty sexy job you got there. And I think it's that widespread acceptance of us still being the outsiders and a little bit isolated and protective over the things that our data can tell us. And I think we need to pivot to being an integrated part of the decision-making community. So I'll stop there if anyone has any questions. Thank you.